The problem is so massive and affects so many people.
They can be killed in very large numbers.
It's hard for the community to look ahead, and in some cases, it's devastating for commercial fishermen.
If you're one of those growers that's being affected by this, it's an existential threat. This is going to happen at some point. You need to be prepared for it.
Welcome to Oyster-ology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host and the food walker, Kevin Cox. When people hear the word disease, it's easy to jump to the wrong conclusion. But today's episode isn't about a disease that affects people. It's about diseases that affect oysters and what happens when those diseases threaten the communities, businesses, and families that depend on them. For decades, two oyster diseases, MSX and Dermo, have challenged oyster growers across the east coast of North America. Most consumers have never heard of them, yet they've shaped the history of oyster farming in places like the Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, and now more recently, Prince Edward Island, Canada. To better understand what's happening and what it means for the future, I sat down with three scientists from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science at their VIMS facility at the William and Mary Batten School of Coastal and Marine Sciences. Dr. Ryan Carnegie is one of North America's leading experts on oyster diseases. Dr. Bill Walton works directly with shellfish growers, helping them apply science to the everyday challenges of aquaculture. And Dr. Adrian Michaelis studies the relationship between oysters, people, and place, exploring how coastal communities respond to change. What began as a conversation about oyster diseases quickly became something much larger. We talked about science, uncertainty, adaptation, and resilience, about how growers respond when a disease appears, how communities weather those moments, and why every outbreak leaves behind lessons that makes the next generation better prepared for the next one. This is a conversation about oysters, but it's also a conversation about the people who depend on them and what it takes for an industry and its communities to endure. So pop on your thinking cap and slip into your lab coats to hear about diseases, parasites, hosts, and infectives, outbreaks that have killed countless oysters, growers and their communities and how they fight back, and the fact that none of this will cause any harm or illness to people, with my esteemed panel of some of the smartest, most well-informed oyster experts on the planet, Drs. Bill Walton, Adrian Michaelis, and Ryan Carnegie. Today, we're taking a deep dive into MSX and into Dermo with probably the three people who are better positioned to talk about it than anybody. And we're going to talk about the oyster disease, the impact that it's having on aquaculture overall, and the impact that it's having on the human dimensions of oyster growing communities. So we have Ryan Carnegie, Bill Walton, and Adrian Michaelis. And welcome so much to Oyster-ology. I really appreciate letting me come down in the gorgeous VIMS Batten School facility in this awesome lab to do this recording live. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, so Ryan, I want to go to you first. You've spent a great deal of time studying MSX and Dermo and other oyster-related, is diseases the right word to call them?
Right.
What is MSX?
MSX is a protozoan parasite, so it's a single-celled marine organism that will attack and infect oysters in wild and aquaculture contexts. MSX has been a cause of very significant disease and mortality since it first emerged in 1957. And it continues to be regarded as one of the major oyster pathogens of the U.S. and Canadian East Coast. And because the oysters have not co-evolved with this protist for their evolutionary history, they are naive to this parasite. They can be killed in very large numbers.
Is it limited geographically to the U.S. and Canadian East Coast?
That's where its impacts are greatest in Chrysostria virginica in our eastern oyster populations. We believe that MSX is an import from Asia that came over sometime prior to 1957 when it first emerged in Delaware Bay. Maybe it arrived with early commercial or scientific imports of Pacific oysters. Maybe it came over with ballast water of ships returning from the Pacific theater after World War II or the Korean conflict. We'll never have an answer to that, but it is known to occur naturally in Pacific oyster populations wherever they occur.
And Kevin, I would just jump in to emphasize that these are diseases of oysters, and these are not parasites that affect people. So from a consumer's point of view, this is something that affects the supply of oysters into the market. It's not affecting the safety of the oysters that anyone is eating.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that point up. I think it's very, very important to emphasize that this is an oyster disease, not a people disease.
Think of this like spots on apples. Like this is something that's not really affecting your experience as a consumer.
I would imagine that by the time an oyster gets to a consumer, it's already been culled through, it's already been identified, and they're certainly not going to sell it and serve it, right?
Exactly.
All right, so that's in essence what MSX is. What is Dermo? Because I often hear people talking about MSX and Dermo almost together.
Well, they're often talked about together because they co-occur along so much of the oyster's distribution in eastern North America. Dermo is another protozoan parasite. It is directly transmissible from oyster to oyster in a reef or in a bag or in a cage, which is a contrast with MSX. MSX is infecting oysters from some intermediate hosts that have never been identified. So the two diseases work a bit differently, but they occur in really all the same places.
Is water quality an issue associated with this as far as you know?
Well, that's a good question. I think we would struggle to come up with any direct evidence of aspects of water quality that are especially meaningful with regard to MSX and dermo dynamics. But then I think on the other hand, water quality is profoundly important with regard to sort of general health and general performance. And so I think that even if we don't see direct effects on these two diseases, water quality is a very big issue for shellfish aquaculture production. We just don't really understand all of what water quality means.
And Ryan, I think the general public, when you say water quality, they're thinking about pollution,
right.
particularly human sewage. And
Yeah.
I just want to be clear that, one of the things we've struggled with, these diseases aren't associated with human sewage.
Right.
No.
Because we've handled problems of human pollution
Right.
with shellfish harvesting by having very clear zones with consistent testing of where you can harvest from and where you can't and under what conditions. So it continues to be a problem because it's not associated with human sewage. Dermo or MSX are in the water. They're a part of the marine environment.
So it's clear that I don't work with the marketing department.
Understanding the disease is only the beginning. The next questions are much more practical, including what does an outbreak actually look like on a working oyster farm? And how can an oyster farmer tell if their farm is being affected? These are the very real, very simple questions that keep growers up at night. How does a grower identify whether their oysters are suffering from either MSX or Dermo? How do you tell?
Oysters that are infected with Dermo or MSX may be smaller than other oysters in the bag from the same cohort, for example. So there could be a reduction in growth, but certainly mortality. Dermo-caused mortality typically is occurring in the late summer and fall, and growers throughout the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the U.S. know to expect a certain level of mortality caused by Dermo in the warmer summer months. MSX mortality can occur almost any time of the year, not just in the warmer summer months. And it can be a very high level of mortality, not the 15 or 20% that might be caused by Dermo, but it might be 60 or 70 or 80%.
Wow. Okay, something these scientists had to explain to me was that while both MSX and Dermo can kill oysters, they don't play by the same rules. Dermo slowly spreads from one oyster to another, like a cold in kindergarten that gets passed around to all the kids who are in the room. While MSX comes from something else in the water, a third-party invader that scientists still haven't identified and which can trigger sudden, severe outbreaks and much faster die-offs.
For Dermo is directly infective. One oyster gets sick, and when it releases the spores, those are brought into another oyster, and it gets sick.
It's like contagious.
Right.
Dermo is directly contagious from one oyster to another, and the higher the density of the oysters, the more transmission that's going to be happening, because that one infected oyster is going to spread the parasite to a whole bunch of its neighbors and establish that next generation of infections that's going to be passed, again, directly from oyster to oyster. And MSX There may be a lot of mortality from MSX. There's a lot of infections and a lot of release of that material to the environment, but we have no idea if all of that release from the oysters actually means anything. It's possible that the parasite is just cycling from one worm to another worm or whatever the life cycle is.
Nice.
I mean, the oyster's acquiring the infections from somewhere. We know that's happening, but we don't know what's happening when the oyster releases the infected material. So we have very limited perspective on the epidemiology of this most important oyster disease. We don't know where it's coming from. We just know that we could see oysters get sick and die.
So, Bill, as a farmer, how do you determine if you have a problem that's either emerging or already there, and what do you do?
Well, like Ryan said, I think, typically the alarm bells go off when you see a lot of dead oysters. Like you go out and this happens in the wild too, but growers, people who are doing aquaculture are looking at their bags. They know pretty much the number that they put in, and they can count the live, and you often see what we call boxes, the empty shells. And so you have a very clear quantitative sense of mortality. It sounds terrible. Anybody that's dumped out a bag of oysters, there really only has to be 1 or 2 dead oysters in there, and you think the whole bag is dead.
That sickening hollow sound.
Yeah, we call it the death rattle. And you dump it out, and you can count those, and you can suddenly find that you've got 15%, 20% mortality because you can actually count it.
Right.
But the most common way I think we see at VIMS is a grower has experienced heavy mortality and wants to know why. And the first thing we always say is we have to see if it's a pathogen, a known pathogen. And so I'll encourage them to contact Ryan or another shellfish pathologist in their area to send samples. And that's often where we'll get you have a lot of Dermo, you have a lot of MSX. A lot of them have it, and they have very bad cases of it. That's probably causing your mortality. But
Right.
as Ryan said, if you're starting to see slower growth, growers have a lot of things that they're looking at in terms of the way the edges of the oyster grow. That's, I think, a little bit harder for us sometimes to put into a quantitative sense. But there are lots of clues they're looking for, including sometimes the meats get a little watery. So there are clues that growers will look at.
So far, we've talked about the disease itself, but the diagnosis is only the beginning. For the people whose livelihoods depend on oysters, the more important question is this. Once you know MSX or Dermo has arrived, what can you actually do about it?
Unfortunately, because it's shellfish aquaculture, we don't feed these animals, so we don't have a way to give them medication. If you've got a crop that has it, you can move up your harvest and try to get as much stuff to market before it dies as possible. You might have another area that you could relay them to, but you'd certainly not want to be spreading the disease. But there are some farms that are big enough that they have low salinity areas and higher salinity areas, and they can move stuff to the low salinity where disease is less of a problem. But really you have to usually look to longer term solutions, and that's like some type of selective breeding and thinking about different types of seed. In terms of stocking density, Dermo is directly infective, but I don't think we have proof that if you grow 200 oysters in a bag versus 100 oysters in a bag that it's going to affect the spread.
For intensive aquaculture, where the animals are harvested in the mid-Atlantic within about a year and a half or thereabouts, the aquaculture is basically doing more good than harm. It's actually a net sink for infective material because the animals are filtering, they're removing Dermo from the water, and then they're removed from the water before they develop serious lethal infections and release that infective material to infect other oysters.
So you're almost, by having the oysters there, it's almost a form of extraction.
Yeah. By the way, it is a cliche, but in terms of what a grower can do, it is that prevention is the best option. And so I mentioned selective breeding, but then there are lots of rules and considerations for biosecurity. And that's another way that you'll know you have disease is that you're trying to transfer seed somewhere and you have to get it tested. And you find out, I can't transfer that seed because it has disease. And so one is just making sure that you're getting seed that's not bringing disease into an area. That's a proactive step before you have it.
Right. But it sounds like, nevertheless, there are situations where a farmer or a whole farming area can be pretty uncertain about what's the future of this year's crop or next year's crop or that sort of thing. What does the community do, Adrian? A whole oyster region that is having this problem, what do they do to address it on kind of a broader basis?
So I think at the community level, it's a challenge. If they're losing both wild or farm, that is loss of crop, loss of wild reefs, that isn't just that 1 year, because oysters don't grow to adulthood within a month or two.
Right.
They thinking sort of generationally, so that business is impacted for several years at least, depending on the scale of disease. And you can see it impact the supply chain, so whoever's buying the oysters, the seed suppliers, if they're also struggling. And larger farms maybe have opportunities to move seeds to lower salinity if they have it. And larger farms may have other opportunities to sort of weather the storm a little bit easier than small scale. But it's still, because of that uncertainty, it's sort of hard for the farmer to predict, hard for the community to look ahead. And in some cases, like where we've had here in the Bay with Dermo and MSX, it wasn't great. It was devastating for commercial fishermen. But many of them are accustomed to adapting and were diversified and working in other fisheries. Some took to land-based jobs. And so there's sort of that, whether it's welcomed or not, most likely not. But the opportunity to diversify and lean into maybe other products that they're growing or other trades that they were doing in addition to the farm could be one way.
Right. Kind of being forced to pivot almost because of the circumstances.
Right. And some farms are better equipped to do that than others. Some fishermen are better equipped to do that than others.
If the wild fishery was being devastated by disease, as it was here in Chesapeake Bay, that actually spurred some people, went into other businesses, but others said, I'm going to do aquaculture, and started growing oysters that way and thinking about how can I get an aquacultured oyster to weather this disease, whether it's resistance or harvesting before they die from it. But there are a number of strategies because, for example, shucking houses, their entire business depends on supply. And so here in Chesapeake Bay, we had a number of growers turn to bottom culture as a way to replace the quantity of oysters that they'd been getting from the wild, which was in decline due to disease.
No oyster farmer wants to hear the words MSX or Dermo, but these diseases have been part of our oyster history for decades. And while every outbreak is different wherever they've happened, the challenges often feel familiar. From the Chesapeake Bay to Prince Edward Island, oyster communities have been forced to adapt, and each one before it has something to teach to the next. You mentioned the Chesapeake Bay and that there was a problem. Tell me a little bit about what happened in the Chesapeake.
There was this event we had in 2023, late 23 into 24, which was extraordinary in that it was an MSX event outbreak some years after we'd had the previous one. We'd had, 15 or so years of relatively light MSX infection pressure, relatively light impacts on aquaculture businesses and so on. And then we started getting reports in the fall of 2023 from growers that they were seeing very high levels of mortality. So we looked at a number of samples from a number of farms and found that there were very high levels of MSX infecting those oysters. And there were probably a few different things going on there, one being that we hadn't had MSX infection pressure in a long time. So, in the wild, there had been so little MSX for so long that the populations probably increased in susceptibility. And when the infection pressure is low, those susceptible genotypes from those upriver areas have a chance to sort of spread into the lower parts of the estuary without any cost because the parasite's not there. It's not active.
Here's the part that really caught me off guard. You'd think that never having MSX would be a good thing, but Ryan explained that oyster populations exposed to the disease over generations can gradually become more resistant. In areas where MSX has never been present, that resistance may never have had a chance to develop. So, ironically, when the disease finally shows up, the losses can be even greater. I'll admit that it took me a minute for my brain to wrap around that.
So probably what happened was there was a general increase in susceptibility in the oyster populations, and they were hammered by MSX when it increased in sort of abundance in the system because the salinities were appropriate. Now in aquaculture, we're not 100% certain about what happened, but we were probably making assumptions about the disease resistance of these animals in aquaculture and in breeding, that everything that we're growing and providing to growers is going to be resistant to both of those diseases. But if the reality was that MSX pressure had fallen away, the breeding populations probably eroded a bit in their resistance to that disease in particular, which probably explains why even in aquaculture with oyster strains resistant to MSX, that we were seeing fairly high MSX impacts. So we're working really hard now to really think about how we can properly have MSX and Dermo on the radar to sort of sharpen and strengthen how we approach these diseases to make sure that we sort of know what we're getting in the performance of these lines.
I think the other thing is, the very human aspect of our growers, if there isn't a disease around, do you focus on making sure that you have seed that's resistant to it? I'm sure this happens in other industries, but we see this in the Northeast with ice, that growers go a number of years without ice, and then you sort of get used to running your farm without ice, or down south without hurricanes. It worked the last 3 years, so I'll get it this year, but this year turns out to be a bad MSX year, and you weren't getting stuff that's resistant to MSX. I mean, so this is where cranky old-timers look back and have the advantage of, this is going to happen at some point. You need to be prepared for it. And so a newer grower, even somebody who's been growing 5 years, you haven't seen those things that have happened across a decade or two.
We hear about MSX from a scientific perspective and what we know and what we don't know, like you've been describing. But how does it fall upon growers and communities that aren't thinking about the science of it, but rather like, what the hell do we do?
Right. So I think from the growers, they're thinking about it, and many of them do know the different diseases or parasites that they're concerned about, and they just want to make sure that they're able to successfully grow and sell that oyster.
Right.
From the community level, like Bill had mentioned at the start here, making sure people know this isn't something that affects humans. It's a disease of oysters, not something that's transmissible.
Yeah.
That's where I think the recognition starts to get a little fuzzy, because people will just hear disease and think that it's something scary for them also. And so when we think about the general public, it gets lumped into other things that could be, a foodborne risk for humans, which it's not. But they just might hear that, and it may affect the public opinion and social acceptability of the industry, or they might hear that there's disease in these waters, and so they may choose to not buy oysters from that region if they're out to eat.
I hear so many people who don't eat a lot of oysters, and they're afraid of them. This compounds on that fear, I guess. How does a community fix that? What do you do? Is it a marketing issue? Is it an advertising thing? How do you educate people in an area that is being affected by this, that it's okay to continue to eat oysters?
I think probably a combination, because people learn in different ways and retain information in different ways. And so part of it might be at the restaurants, at the seafood shop where they're buying their oysters, to educate and make sure people know what's coming out and that what's being sold is still safe, and that if they can support the oysters that have survived whatever disease is affecting that area, then they're supporting those farms and supporting those fishermen.
By now, it's clear that MSX isn't just an oyster story. Its effects ripple far beyond the water. Behind every oyster farm is a family, and behind many of those families are generations of hard work. Parents and grandparents who built a business hoping one day to pass it on to their children. Entire coastal communities have grown up around those working waterfronts. So when something like MSX threatens not just a crop, but a way of life, how does both a grower and an entire community respond?
Whether it's accurate or not, the rumors associated or what people start to fear last for years. Even 10 years after the oil spill, people were still questioning about eating oysters from the Gulf, even though the oysters were safe to eat. I think it does start to wear on people when they're thinking about if they're going to stay in the industry, because, again, those businesses that are able to weather the storm, do they want to? How many times do they want to deal with this in the years ahead? And is this something that they want to pass on to children? Are their children there to pass it on to? We're seeing more broadly, separate from disease, with challenges of passing along a business and finding successors and heirs. Yeah. And so I think that certainly weighs in to, just one more factor that could be something that steers someone away. And thinking about it, if there's an insurance program that can support the losses that they face reliably. Right. It sort of just introduces more risk to wanting to stay in the business, and for the community to be relying on that as a broader economic input for the community.
Have you found that the growth of aquaculture in communities hard hit has slowed down? Has it really driven people away, or are there just, old people getting out and new people getting in? What kind of long-term growth impact does this have on communities?
I think there's certainly been patterns where we've seen growth slow down a little bit in areas after a sort of initial surge and innovation period.
Right.
It's one of those challenges to your sustainability of your business. And anybody that's on the edge, it has the potential to knock out of the business for sure. We've seen this with some of the other things like the sudden unusual mortalities, where people have to ask, is that worth doing? And generally it's the ones who are closer to the edge already that say this is not worth doing.
Right.
It does spur some innovation too. There are people who are invested enough that they're looking at, how do I survive this? How do I come out of this?
When you consider the investment that's necessary, especially with modern technology, once you make that investment, farmers tend to feel kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's like, well, I made this big investment, but I'm losing all my oysters, so what do I do?
I think there's something to that. I think we see that with any of the big companies, that once you've expanded, you must keep succeeding, and so there is something to that. But I think there's something about shellfish aquaculture. I think it's one of those things where you're producing something, and I think that one of the sort of the nature of the people who do this is sort of problem solving and how do I make this better. And so I think you see that sometimes come out with challenges like disease.
History tells us that diseases like MSX don't simply come and go and are forgotten. They become part of the story of oyster farming. Communities have faced these challenges before, and each time they've found new ways to adapt. The science has improved. The technology has improved. And with every outbreak, we've learned a little more about how to protect both oysters and the people who depend on them.
I think it's helpful to sort of step a bit further back and think about some of the historical stuff. The early MSX disease outbreak in the 50s, 57 in Delaware Bay, 59 in Chesapeake Bay, there were wild fisheries that were impacted by that. There was a planting industry that was tremendous in the Virginia part of Chesapeake Bay. I mean, it was worth, many, many millions of dollars, and that supported thriving communities all around the shores of the lower part of the Bay region. And when MSX hit in 59 and 60, it basically ended that planting industry, with only vestiges remaining in the upper parts of the big rivers beyond where MSX could reach. And we still have some big players in the industry that are representing businesses that hung on in those areas. But others were forced to pivot. Cherrystone Aqua Farms was the old Ballard Fish and Oyster company, that was doing a lot of wild harvesting and extensive planting. And, they and some of the other businesses, H.M. Terry and Walker Brothers, pivoted to clamps. But the upheaval caused by those early outbreaks affecting early aquaculture in the region lasted half a century or more. And where we are now, we had an MSX outbreak in Maine in 2006 or 7 or something. It was devastating in the Damascata, but it was over in about a year because we had different tools now to deal with this stuff. We do have selective breeding that we can rely on to, get resistant seed into the hands of growers to navigate this crisis as quickly as possible. If we have a new pathogen emerging, we have genetic tools to respond to that. So it's not that it's not stressful to the growers and the communities and so on, but relative to where we were historically in being able to deal with this stuff, we're in much better shape now.
The lessons of the past are being put to the test once again. Today, Prince Edward Island is confronting one of the most significant MSX outbreaks in its history. It's a challenge that's testing one of the world's great oyster-producing regions, with consequences felt far beyond oyster beds. And this isn't a problem that farmers can solve alone. It takes scientists, hatcheries, processors, government agencies, and entire communities working together, each playing a role in protecting an industry that's woven into the very fabric of Prince Edward Island. Let's talk a little bit about PEI. Right now, they're really embroiled in a crisis situation with MSX. How long has that been going on up there?
It was about 2 years ago that MSX first was discovered in the context of unusual mortality in Prince Edward Island.
Do the oysters die immediately, or is there a progression where they get unhealthier and unhealthier and then ultimately die? And can a farmer or a community do something to backfill or buttress that inevitability?
That's a good question. MSX is a very acute disease, so it tends to kill very quickly. It doesn't take years. MSX can kill within weeks, and it can kill oysters of any size. I'm talking a lot to PEI interests, growers, to regulators, and so on. And it seems like there are areas where they're discovering they're being heavily impacted by mortality. There are other areas where the parasite is detected at lower prevalence and not yet causing any mortality, suggesting that there may be a crisis sort of on the horizon within a month or 2 or 3 or so. These are very short timelines within an MSX outbreak, from discovery to to devastation, really. And we know that there will be a light at the end of the tunnel for the wild resource based on evolutionary processes. Eventually, the oysters will become resistant to these diseases, and many more of them will grow to market size and survive. But the whole other part regarding aquaculture is getting fast-growing, disease-resistant seed into the hands of the growers so they can get that onto their farms and sort of get through the crisis as quickly as possible by getting something surviving to market. And that's where the engagement with the U.S. has been focused. We have disease-resistant animals that grow very quickly, and that's part of the secret of their success. It's not just that they can fight off the parasites, but they can sprint to market size and get to the raw bar or the supermarkets before the parasites catch up to them. So getting that seed into the hands of the PEI growers is critical. The question has been for PEI, how do you do that? Is it importing U.S. animals? Is it developing it completely sort of de novo within the Canadian setting where they're experiencing this outbreak?
It sounds like it requires a large-scale, community-wide, or even governmentally sponsored kind of mobilization to take these precautions and safeguards for the future. Have you seen communities that have been able to mobilize and really address the issue and get through it together? Because I would think this is almost an existential issue for PEI or other communities.
In some cases, I've seen where communities have leaned into aquaculture as a way to support a struggling wild fishery, whether it's providing resources or seeking funding to do so to support a larger initiative that's more than just an individual.
Somewhere along the way, I realized this conversation had stopped being just about oyster diseases. It had become a conversation about how people respond. Scientists adapt, growers adapt, communities adapt. And each challenge leaves behind new knowledge, and every crisis teaches new lessons. But the response of a community is rarely simple. It requires difficult decisions, competing priorities, and people from across an industry working together to protect not just oysters, but the families, businesses, and very way of life that depend on them. And that's when I realized that we had been talking about resilience all along. What does it take for one community to be resilient in the face of either disease or other conditions so that they survive compared to communities that don't?
I guess when I think about resilience, it's sort of complex big picture where some of the challenges that we'll see are if they are limited by labor, they can't find employees, but they also don't have housing because housing has become unaffordable. So when we're thinking about these coastal areas, even some of the rural ones, it's becoming tougher to eke out a living there. And so employees are being sought from farther away, and then that makes it less ideal if they're making that commute to get to a farm.
Is there access to the waterfront?
Right.
Are there areas to work on the waterfront?
Yeah.
If the industry has been gone for 30 years and there's no living memory of when there was an industry,
And I think that's a challenge with the uncertainty of a disease outbreak. If it is something that lasts for a while, what happens during that while if these businesses have to shut down and shutter, right, and then someone buys them and develops something else there that may not suit a future?
There are more practical realities of the thing is very interesting that you mentioned, Adrian, and that is labor force, housing, all of the what maybe I would call the ancillary aspects of supporting an aquaculture community. You're not going to bring in a new labor force, or I'm not going to move to a small town because I want to be an oyster farmer if I hear that the oysters are diseased or dying or that there's not going to be any money or long-term employment in it, right?
I would say you are vulnerable to lots of changes, external forces that can push you to the edge and potentially out. And, aquaculture is a way that we've seen coastal communities around the U.S. and the world, that's one way that they have kept their communities going. You have industries there that rely on the water, rely on clean water, that have people out working on the water. Then it becomes a matter of whether the community embraces that or decides, I don't like the look of that. If you grew up with the idea that oysters are all harvested from reefs, and so it's those beautiful boats going out with these hardworking people that are like pulling oysters off the bottom. I love that. I want that to exist. But I also just want the coastal communities to have working waterfronts, and we know that shellfish aquaculture works. And so when I look at a community, Cedar Key, Florida, has embraced clam farming as one of the things that defines it. And so I feel like every third pier in Cedar Key is a clam nursery, and there are clam farmers everywhere. Like at Christmas, they have clam in lights on the streets. It's part of their identity.
So Cedar Key, for example, has boat ramps that are exclusively for commercial industry, so that they can't be overtaken by weekend boaters, recreational boaters.
Right.
And so there's certainly things in place in other areas. Up in Cambridge, Maryland, there's marinas that have commercial slips that there's a required minimum number of commercial slips that will be there. And so there's approaches like that to help ensure that waterfront can stay working despite efforts to redevelop.
So someone's not going to be able to build their $1 million house on that shoreline because of that priority for the commercial aquaculturists.
Right. And there's always the question of that can change. So how many years, if there's not oysters being produced, can they sort of maintain that claim? And so that's where having that broader community support to show that this is something that's important to us, this is something we value, and we're waiting for this to come back or to help ensure that it does come back.
I think of places in Maine where they've said this is something that we do. So you do need a community to say this is something that we want to do. When we think about the Canadian Maritimes, aquaculture is something that they do. PEI, they're doing it. They're in a position, though, that their aquaculture has depended on harvest of wild seed. And so they've had this tremendous bounty of seed from nature, and that is now in jeopardy. And so that's why you have to then turn to this idea of hatcheries. Hatcheries can be limiting in communities because they're expensive. They take a certain set of skills to run, and those set of skills aren't everywhere. You have to find the people that can do it. And so I think one of the questions logistically for that area will be, can they build those hatcheries? Can they staff those hatcheries? Will they support them? And then the question will be, how many growers can those hatcheries supply?
One of the things I found really interesting was how the response to oyster diseases grows in proportion to the challenge it presents. A farmer can respond to problems on his farm. A community can respond to challenges facing its local industry. But when an entire oyster-producing region is threatened, the response has to expand even further. That's where universities, industry associations, public agencies, and governments become part of the story. Investing in research, coordinating resources, and helping oyster communities respond to challenges that no one can solve alone.
The problem is so massive and affects so many people, the growers, the people who are trying to transport those oysters, that certainly in Virginia, state and then federal funds were brought in to try to tackle the problem. The public made investments here.
Oh, there were myriad public investments. And I mean, notably, there was the creation of an oyster disease research program in the 1980s. It was administered by Sea Grant that supported literally decades of really important science, a lot of it behind the breeding and disease management that helped provide the scientific foundations for the growth and recovery of these aquaculture industries. And then a lot of investments at different scales in shellfish restoration, planting, shell, creating new reefs, and so on, to help on sort of the conservation and restoration angles. But all of that was very, very important, in coming together to support the communities that were dependent on these resources.
Here in the Chesapeake, we've got something called the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance, and that brings together restoration and growers and managers and fisheries with the goal really of the bay. The premise is the bay is better off with more oysters in it. And so the way we get to the most oysters in the bay is by having that mix. I think they're sort of swimming in the same direction.
But certainly where one region's loss could be another one's gain, and we're already seeing where folks are filling the gaps that the Canadian oysters previously filled. And
right.
So that comes that uncertainty again with when they start producing again. Will their buyers want those oysters back, or will they be happy with what they're now getting consistently from somewhere else?
Right.
Will the consumers want those back?
One of the things I found myself thinking about as the conversation unfolded was the importance of keeping all of this in perspective. For the people living through an outbreak like the one in Prince Edward Island, this is a very real crisis with serious consequences for families, businesses, and entire communities. It deserves attention, investment, and a thoughtful response. But MSX isn't unique to PEI, and it's important to remember that oyster farming has faced diseases like this before. Across North America, different oyster growing regions have confronted different diseases, environmental pressures, and other crises over the years. None of that minimizes what's happening on PEI, but instead it reminds us that responding to these realities has always been part of oyster farming. The locations change, the diseases change, the response evolves, and together it reminds us of something important. These are only moments in the continuing story of oyster farming, not the end of it, but just another step in its evolution. How big a problem is this in the overall world of oysters and oyster aquaculture? Is this something that is really damaging the whole industry, or is it localized enough that it's a problem if you're one of the farmers or if you're living in the community where that grows, but it sort of doesn't go beyond that?
Well, that's a good question. Disease generally, it's a problem. It can cause unacceptably high losses. It's just one of these things that, we need to constantly, one, be vigilant against the possible introduction or emergence of new diseases. We constantly need to be working to try to find the answers to better managing the diseases we have. There's a lot of news about MSX right now, and that's, mostly localized, Atlantic Canadian effects. But, we have plenty of farmers that are growing the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, the Gulf Coast, that are experiencing problems that are just as challenging, just with other disease problems. So, I'm not sure that's the best answer to your question, but MSX, it's a local issue that flares up here and there across the vast oyster geography. Disease generally is a problem that everybody is challenged with everywhere on an almost daily basis. How am I going to beat one or another of these pathogens and get enough of this stuff to market that I'm running a profitable business? And if you don't have a problem now, that's not to say that you're not going to have a problem tomorrow, which is why we need to, keep our eyes on the ball and focused on alertness, passive surveillance, what's going on, are there changes that we need to get on top of, something new emerging, and what are we doing to manage these chronic endemic diseases now?
From my point of view, I would say, if you're one of those growers in the Canadian Maritimes that's being affected by this, or the people that work with them, it's an existential threat. I truly hope that the provincial governments and the federal government of Canada address this as the crisis that it is. From the big picture of sort of the oyster industry and the oyster aquaculture industry, as Ryan said, there are going to be these problems in there and other places, but the industry is strong enough and resilient enough that consumers will still have oysters. There'll still be an oyster industry. There'll still be farmers growing oysters.
As our conversation began to wind down, I wanted to hear one final thought from my scientist guests, each reflecting the unique perspective they bring to the oyster world. Bill through aquaculture and applied biology, Ryan through oyster disease research, and Adrian through relationships between oysters, people, and place. If you were advising a new person wanting to get into aquaculture today, what would the number one piece of advice that you would give them be? Other than run far, run
well, no,
fast.
I think, probably all of us, we've all been asked about it. I think one thing we do is do a gut check and go see what it's actually like, because make sure that you're not doing it because of the romance of it. But if I had somebody that really wanted to do it, my first, and I know this isn't disease related explicitly, but is site selection, that making sure that you have a site that the environment supports good growth, that logistically works, that has access to markets, that you have the community supporting it, that is feasible, and that you could get permitted. So I would start with the site is always my first one, because sometimes I have people that have fallen in love with the idea of oyster farming and they want to use the latest and greatest gear, and so they've fallen in love with that. Or they've fallen in love with the idea of growing an oyster that they think they're going to get $2 for or whatever when they sell it. And I think you have to start with the site, because that will tell you how fast it grows, how well it survives, and what it's going to taste like. So I start with site.
If there was one scientific question, Ryan, about MSX that we don't currently know that you wish could be answered? The top question, what would that be?
Well, I think the top question for MSX is, where is it when it's not infecting the oysters? What is the intermediate host? It's something in our marine systems. It's something that's intimate with oyster reefs, oyster bags, and cages, probably some small invertebrate that we've seen 1,000 times, but we just haven't figured out what that host is, or hosts. It could be more than one. But having that information, it would provide levers for management that we don't currently have now, because we just, this whole area of the parasite's life cycle is just a huge gap in our knowledge. So that's the big question.
I think it's critical to note that the industry relies on the wild set. And so I think that's why they're going to be challenged by responding to this. That there's no quick fix because it's requiring them to do a complete shift in how they've done their stocking of their farms.
What do you wish an oyster community or oyster aficionados, what's the one most important thing you would want them to know about MSX?
I think it is the knowledge that it's not a disease that affects the consumer, but also make an effort to support those industries if they're struggling. And, maybe there are other ways you can support the industry if you can't buy their oysters.
Not to mention eat more oysters.
Right. Keep eating oysters. Try some new ones.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for coming here, giving me your time, very generous to prepare for this and to talk to me about this.
Right.
So I really
Absolutely.
appreciate it. Well, that's it for this episode of Oyster-ology. My great thanks to Drs. Ryan Carnegie, Adrian Michaelis, and Bill Walton for sharing their expertise and their perspectives on the relationship between oysters, disease, people, and place. As I listened to this conversation, I realized that while we spent a lot of time talking about MSX and Dermo, this story was never really just about oyster diseases. It's about scientists working to better understand these parasites, growers adapting to changing conditions, and communities finding new ways to respond to challenges that no one can solve alone. Just like so many other chapters in the history of oyster farming, this one is ultimately about adaptation, innovation, and perseverance. Links to the VIMS website and the detailed bios of our esteemed scientists are included in the show notes, along with a transcript of this episode. And please follow Oyster-ology wherever you listen to podcasts. The more followers we get, the more others will discover us too. And if you like this episode, have questions for my guests, or would like to say something about your own experience with MSX or Dermo, please leave a comment to let me know. In the meantime, keep enjoying oysters. Support your local oyster farmers, your seafood markets, and restaurants. Every oyster you enjoy helps support the people and communities who work so hard to produce them. And the most important takeaway from this episode is that MSX and Dermo are diseases of oysters, not diseases of people. They do not make oysters unsafe to eat, they are not harmful to humans, and they should never be confused with foodborne illnesses. The diseases affect oyster production, not consumer safety. Or in the words of Bill Walton,
Like spots on apples, it's not affecting the safety of the oysters that anyone is eating.
thanks so much for listening, and be sure to join us again next time when we pry open the shell of another interesting oysterology topic.